When I think of someone getting something that they in no way deserve, I immediately think of my 8-year-old sister Shannon. My little sister who one day got a big old bag of candy from a woman at church for doing nothing more than turning 8. Now, I at the time was 10, and in that I had no candy of my own, I thought it right that I have some of hers. Seemed fair. She had some, I had none. She should give me some of hers. Problem solved. But she didn't see the obviousness of that remedy near as clearly as I did. In fact, she thought very little of my solution to the problem of me having no candy of my own. In fact, she didn't see how that was any problem at all, at least for her. So I changed my tack. I told her that any old person could turn 8 years old. In fact, I had pulled off the exact same thing only 2 years before, so give me some candy. She remained unconvinced, however. And so seeing the writing on the wall, I decided to turn to desperate measures. I don't recall exactly how it went. It may have involved crying, perhaps yelling, hopefully not too much threatening. But I made a big scene, and by the end, she relented. I say she relented because what she ultimately offered me was 6 black jelly beans. 6 licorice-tasting jelly beans. Now, everyone knows black licorice jelly beans are no good. For a 10-year-old, it's like the worst thing ever. No kid wants these things. And certainly my sister did not want them. In fact, if she had eaten every bit of candy in that entire bag, the only thing that she was going to voluntarily leave behind would be those 6 jelly beans. She hates black jelly beans, and so she wasn't giving me a gift. She was saving herself a trip to the trash can, which was unfair. I was older, bigger, a good deal meaner, and I wanted a couple of red or yellow or green jelly beans given in deference to those attributes. Shannon was not deferential, however. She remains that way today. She looked me right in the eye from her exalted position of jelly bean power and said to me, "Beggars can't be choosers." Beggars can't be choosers. That's what she said. Beggars don't have the luxury of choice because, after all, they are beggars. I was a beggar. Shannon was the chooser, and I ate nasty black jelly beans because of it, because beggars can't be choosers. Now, when it comes to God, I would hope that all of us can admit that each and every one of us is a beggar. I hope that we know that, although I know that we each are good at forgetting it. But the point of today's gospel lesson tells us that we are also choosy beggars, at least when it comes to how God treats all the other beggars out there in the world. God is gracious to us, great, and then God is gracious to others, and we seem to have an issue with that, which is what's underneath the parable of the vineyard workers that we just heard, about an owner of a vineyard who needs some employees, and so he goes out and he calls some people to work. And by all that we can tell, those who were picked at first were just thrilled by the selection. They felt special by being asked, perhaps. They were invited in right from the beginning. Only they end up not feeling quite so special by the end of the day, because everybody ends up getting an invitation to come into the vineyard. One by one, throughout the day, all are invited until by the end, everyone's in. Now, this does seem to take some of the shine off of being picked first. But still, it all seems to be going okay until the wages are paid, and everyone is given the exact same amount of money. The person who labored for 8 hours gets no more money than the guy who sat around all day and only worked an hour. Now, at this point, this may seem so crazy that you're just tempted to toss this aside with other outrageous statements from Jesus that you just don't get. More of the first shall be last, love your enemies, sell all your belongings and give it for the sake of the poor sort of stuff that we very easily, probably too easily, toss aside because we don't know how to fit it into our worldviews. But I want you to notice that the reason that this story sounds so outrageous to us is because this is a story about grace. And grace is always outrageous. And yet grace is also very much at the heart and the soul of our faith, even though it's outrageous. Because grace is getting something that you don't deserve. Now, the story tells us that we don't mind it when we get what we don't deserve. We just mind it when someone else gets something that they don't deserve. See, all of the workers were beneficiaries of a sort of grace because without the invitation to come into the vineyard, they would have all been left behind. But the problem is that those who worked all day didn't consider their employment grace. Employees rarely do. And yet they should have in this case, for without the invitation to come in to the vineyard, no one would have been in the vineyard. And so the story ends with grumbling. No big surprise there. Because God isn't playing by the rules. And a God who doesn't play by the rules is a God who tends to keep us off balance, wondering what sort of thing he's going to pull next. And of course, we just love the rules, at least our rules, when they benefit us. Now, a major problem with how we perceive this parable is this. We hear the story and immediately identify with all the hardworking, all-day people. You did that, right? I did too. And yet, this is 100% wrong for almost certainly every single person in this room. Why do I say that? Because the people who were last to come into the vineyard, well, that's us, Gentiles. The people invited in first, the people of Israel, the people invited in last, us. But we all get the same treatment. And all of a sudden, this changes how you hear the story, doesn't it? See, this isn't your older brother cheating you at Monopoly so that he always gets to win. What this is about is our Father in heaven giving of himself, giving out of his own resources so that we all get to win, so that we all get to be included. And if we are paying attention, we should all of a sudden very much like it that God does not play by the rules. If God played by the rules, we would all be losers. I mean, if God played by the rules, the Egyptians would still be slave masters over the Israelites. They were stronger, and the rules say the strong always get their way. If God played by the rules, Israel would have starved out in the desert. There was no food because it was a desert. They don't have Krogers in deserts. It's kind of the rules of the desert. And yet they ate manna from heaven. If God had played by the rules, Jesus would still be dead, and the kingdom of God a charade, because the rules say dead people stay dead. If God played by the rules, we would, each and every one of us, be left behind, because all of us are undeserving of him. And so thank God every day that God doesn't play by the rules. Jesus ends by saying, "And so it shall be that the first shall be last, and the last shall be first." Have you ever thought about that? Why is it that the first are last? Because the first in our world are always, using metrics, the metrics of our world, to line everybody up so that they always get to be first. I'm first because I have more degrees than you. I'm first because my bank account has more, and I'm first because I have a smaller waist size than you do. I'm first because of where I was born. I'm first. And yet think about that from the perspective of God. Not one bit of that impresses God. We don't impress God. By the metrics of God, none of us measure up, and yet God still invites. He still welcomes. He still shares his life. He still loves. And it all works out okay until we go around demanding that God starts judging folks like we judge folks. I deserve more. I'm better in some way. I must always win. I must always be first. In other words, when we become choosy beggars. And even then, God lovingly says, quit being so choosy. Just lean on into that beggar status. Because see, around here, you're not more precious than anyone else. You are precious like everyone else. And the only way to end up last is to keep somehow claiming that you get to be first by being a choosy beggar. When I was a child, my mom told me a story over and over and over again about grace. And as a Southern boy raised in an old Southern gospel church, it was a story that I could most definitely understand because it was about Sunday picnics. You remember those old-fashioned church picnics, you'd say. It was the middle of the summer. They'd say, we'll meet at Sycamore Lodge in Shelby Park at 1 p.m. Sunday. You bring your lunch and we'll furnish the tea. But you came home at the last minute, and when you got ready to pack your lunch, all you could find in the refrigerator was one dried up piece of bologna and just enough mustard in the bottom of the jar so that you got it all over your knuckles trying to get to it. And to boot, there were just 2 stale slices of bread, and even one of those was a hill. But you really wanted to go. And so you made your bologna sandwich, and you wrapped it in some brown bag, and off you went to the picnic. And when it came time to eat, you sat at the end of a table, and you spread out your sandwich. But the folks next to you, well, the lady was an amazing cook. And she, unlike you, worked all day. And she had fried chicken and had baked beans and fixed potato salad and made homemade rolls, brought fresh fruit and pickles and olives and chips, and topped it off with 2 great big homemade chocolate pies. And they spread it all out there right beside you. And there you were with your bologna sandwich. And they looked over at your meal. And you looked over at theirs, and they said, why don't we just put it all together? No, I couldn't even think about doing that. And yet they pushed all the harder. Oh, come on, there's plenty of chicken, there's plenty of pie, there's plenty of everything, and besides, we just love bologna sandwiches. Let's just put it all together. And so you did. And there you sat, eating like a king, even though you came like a pauper. In honesty, when we measure up our lives and put them against the big things with which we have to contend in our lives and the big things that are going on in our world, we pretty quickly, if we're honest, start noticing that we don't have enough. We don't have enough love or faith or grace or mercy or understanding or wisdom to offer to the equation a lot of times. There's just not enough to us. And yet God has enough. God has all of those things and more, and he says, why don't we just put it all together? In the church, you'll hear words like consecration and denial and sacrifice and commitment, and we listen to that and we hear them as hard, flinty words to us until we start to see them in the light of sharing, in the light of God's grace. This is not about us just kicking in what we have because God's the biggest kid on the block and he wants it all for himself. No, God is speaking to you right now, and I believe that. And what he's saying to you is that everything I am and everything that I can be for a person, I will be with you. I will share with you. I invite you into that. Through my grace, you can have everything I am. And when you look at it like that, it should really make us sad to see some choosy beggar running through life hanging onto their dumb bag with that stale bologna sandwich in it, saying, God's not going to get my sandwich. No, sir, this is mine. Did you ever see anybody like that? So needy, just about half starved to death, hanging on for dear life, never even realizing that it's not that God needs our sandwich at all. It's that we need his chicken. We've got to learn to unclutch our hands. And when we do, we discover that when we start sharing with God, we're always going to be more. We will never be less. We'll always be better. We're never going to be worse because unlike the arithmetic of this world, God doesn't come to divide or subtract, but he always comes to add and to multiply. And so whatever equations that you're doing to gauge who you are in this great big world of ours, let me just tell you that with God, it will always be more. Because he invites you today to come and share in his very being. You get to share in the very being of God, to enter into the vineyard of his grace. My friends, there's something better than that sandwich. Amen.